Hi everyone, before I begin this episode, I would like to take a moment to announce the Trail Went Cold's plans for the near future. The world has become a pretty chaotic place right now, and there's some important issues which need to be explored. This week's particular episode was already recorded before the recent events involving the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent riots took place, but starting next week on June the 17th, we have completely rearranged our originally planned episode schedule, and we're going to be spending an entire month releasing episodes which exclusively cover lesser-known unsolved cold cases in which the victims were persons of color. These stories need all the attention they can get, and this is the right time to do it. So thank you, and enjoy this week's episode, and I hope everyone stays safe out there. June 11th, 1930. New York City. While parked inside his car with his mistress at a secluded Lover's Lane area, 39-year-old Joseph Mozynski is shot to death by an unidentified assailant who leaves his female companion alive and gives her a cryptic note. 5 days later, 26-year-old Noel Sowley is fatally shot at another Lover's Lane area under similar circumstances, and the gunman also leaves his girlfriend alive and gives her another note. The killer sends out a series of letters claiming that he is a secret agent from an organization called the Red Diamond of Russia and committed the murders while on a mission to recover some important documents. All of his letters are signed 3X, but in spite of an extensive manhunt, the perpetrator is never identified, and the 3X murders remain unsolved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering an old-time mystery from the 1930s, the 3X murders. This case was originally requested to me a while ago by a listener named Corbin, and since the date of this episode's official release is 1 day removed from the 90th anniversary of the first murder, I thought now would be an ideal time to finally cover it. The story involves a pair of murders which took place in New York City, and in both cases, an unidentified man interrupted a couple while they were making out in a secluded Lover's Lane area, where he proceeded to shoot the male, but left the female alive, and escorted her to the nearest public transportation before giving her a cryptic note. The police and the press would soon receive a series of bizarre letters from the killer, signed 3X, which he claimed was his code name from being a secret agent. I'll go into more details about this later, but 3X claimed that he belonged to a secret Russian organization and that the two murdered victims, Joseph Mozynski and Noel Sowley, had betrayed them, so he was assigned the mission of recovering some important documents from their possession. Of course, the victims' families maintained that this was all delusional nonsense, and neither man had any affiliation with a secret Russian organization, which was likely true. But since it seemed like they were deliberately targeted, what could the killer's real motive have been? As I'm sure you probably noticed, the 3X murders have quite a few parallels with the crimes committed by some other notorious serial killers, including the Zodiac and the Son of Sam. While this case was a pretty sensational story in New York back in 1930, it's pretty much forgotten about today, as 3X seemed to come to a stop after committing these two murders, and was never caught or identified. It's a truly bizarre story which has a lot more questions than answers, but I'm going to tackle it as best as I can on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the rabbit hole known as the 3X murders. Our story begins in New York City in 1930, and our first victim is 39-year-old Joseph Mozynski, who usually goes by the name Joe. Joe lives with his wife Stella and their 2 children, and owns a grocery store in the borough of Queens. On the evening of June 11th, Joe asked Stella to watch over the store because he needed to step out for a while to run some errands. What Stella did not know was that her husband had spent the past 2 years carrying on a secret affair with his 19-year-old mistress, Catherine May, the daughter of his former landlord. Joe picked up Catherine in his sedan and drove to a secluded wooded area in the College Point neighborhood, which was known for being a popular Lover's Lane hangout, but shortly after they arrived, an horrific crime would take place. Joe did not return home that night, and his sedan would be discovered in that secluded area the following morning with his body inside. He had been shot once behind the right ear, and a second bullet was fired through the mouth, which shattered his teeth and exited through his cheek. A blood-stained woman's coat was left behind at the scene, and police found Catherine May's photograph in Joe's pocket, along with a baseball pool ticket which had been stamped in Philadelphia for the receipt of $3,700. Catherine would soon be identified after police showed the photo to Stella, who recognized her. When she was tracked down and questioned, Catherine confirmed that she was in the sedan with Joe the previous night and personally witnessed his murder. According to Catherine, they were making out in the back seat when they were suddenly interrupted by someone whom she described as a small, slender man who appeared to be around 40 years old. This man spoke in what sounded like a German accent and pointed a gun at Joe, ordering him to climb into the driver's seat. When Joe complied, the man climbed into the back seat next to Catherine and told Joe to start the car. However, right after Joe started the ignition, the gunman fired a shot behind Joe's right ear, and when the force caused Joe to spin around and face the back seat, the second shot was fired into his mouth. According to Catherine, the assailant then proceeded to rape her before he exited the vehicle and started searching through Joe's pockets. He pulled out some papers and looked at them before setting them on fire with a match. While this was going on, Catherine tried to sneak out of the car until the gunman turned to her and said, quote, "I'll have to murder you if you don't behave." Well, in spite of the fact that she witnessed a murder and had been sexually assaulted, Catherine soon learned that she was going to be allowed to live. After asking for her home address, the assailant escorted her to the nearest bus stop. When a bus arrived, they boarded it together, and the man proceeded to give Catherine a note, warning her not to read it until the following day. After arriving at a bus terminal, he escorted Catherine onto a trolley before they parted ways. The trolley took Catherine back to her home, but before she arrived, she decided to have a look at the note the killer gave her and discovered that a message had been stamped on it in red ink. It read, quote, "Joseph Mozynski, 3X, 3-X-097. Catherine elected not to contact the police about the incident, not only because she was terrified, but also because she did not want her family to know she had become involved with a married man. Of course, when the police finally tracked Catherine down, they had a hard time believing her story, so she was taken to the police station and held as a material witness under a $50,000 bail. Over the next few days, Catherine would be extensively interrogated and subject to sleep deprivation. The experience had such a devastating psychological effect on Catherine that she started fabricating stories about what happened, which included implicating an innocent man who was a former admirer of hers, as well as an Italian gangster who did not even exist. At one point, Catherine even went so far as to falsely confess to having committed the murder herself. But while this was going on, the city editor of the newspaper, the New York Evening Journal, received an odd letter which started with the words, quote, "Kindly print this letter in your paper for Mozynski's friends," which was followed by what appeared to be a jumbled code of letters and numbers that ended with the word Queens. The rest of the letter read, quote, "By doing this, you may save their lives, and the women may know where the missing papers are and who has them, since they were given to Mozynski. We do not want any more shooting unless we have to." End quote. It was signed 3X, the man behind the gun. Since it turned out the letter had been postmarked hours before Joseph Mozynski's body was even discovered, it was deemed credible enough to be turned over to the police as evidence. On June the 13th, the Evening Journal published a story about the murder, but made no mention of the letter, so they wound up receiving a second letter the following day. It read, quote, "Gentlemen, for your information, the young lady, Miss C. May, involved in this case, is innocent and a victim of unfortunate circumstances. Mozynski was nothing but a rascal, a dirty rat. Not 2 women as stated in the papers, but 6, and 2 young girls, one 14 and one 15, were with him in that same place. I am the agent of a secret international order, and when I met Mozynski that night, it was to get from him certain documents, but unfortunately, they were not in his possession at that time. If his relative knew so much of his luck with women, maybe he would tell us what became of the following items: NYX-26-73, NJ 4-3-44, Philadelphia XV 346. These papers must be returned to us at once, or 14 more of Mozynski's friends will join him. Mozynski's relatives and friends have up to Monday, 12 p.m. to bring these documents to us, or to have someone get in touch with us and tell us where to find them. If no answer is received by that time, we will start merry hell for all of them." End quote. Once again, the letter was signed 3X, the man behind the gun. But this time, the 3X was preceded by what appeared to be an inverted V, followed by a regular upright V. The Evening Journal article had contained a quote from one of Joe's relatives about how he allegedly had a second mistress besides Catherine May, which could have been the context for the writer's quote, not 2 women as stated in the papers, but 6. Interestingly enough, the letter was written on stationery from the Civil Service Bureau office in College Point, which also happened to be Catherine's workplace. Well, this letter was not published by the Evening Journal either, but it wasn't long before a second murder would take place. On the evening of June 16th, Noel Sowley, a 26-year-old radio mechanic from the Bergen Beach neighborhood in Brooklyn, picked up his 18-year-old girlfriend Elizabeth Ring, who usually went by the name Betty. Noel drove his vehicle to a secluded auto salvage yard located near the Floral Park neighborhood in Queens. The couple had planned to make out there, but were immediately interrupted when a man carrying a flashlight suddenly showed up outside the vehicle and pointed a gun at Noel while he was still in the driver's seat. Once again, he spoke with what sounded like a German accent and ordered Noel to hand over his driver's license. After looking at it, the man turned his flashlight towards a spot in the distance and started flicking it on and off before informing Noel that he was signaling to his friends that he did not need any assistance. He then asked Noel if he knew Joe Mozynski, but when Noel said no, the man shot him in the mouth. In spite of his wound, Noel managed to get out the words, "I'm not the man you're looking for," prompting the gunman to walk behind the car and shine his flashlight on the rear license plate. When he returned, the man stated, quote, "You're the one we want, all right. You're going to get what Joe got." He then fired a second fatal shot into Noel's head before performing a search of his pockets, where he apparently found a piece of paper which prompted him to say, "I have it." He then turned to Betty and seemed to give off the impression that he was going to rape her, but when she pleaded with him, said she was Catholic, and held up a religious medal she had around her neck, he decided to back off and said he wouldn't touch her on account of what she was wearing. Much like with Catherine May, the killer left Betty alive and escorted her to the nearest bus stop. They boarded a bus and rode together for a while before the killer handed Betty a note and warned her not to talk. He soon got off at a stop, and Catherine had a look at the note, which had the name Sowley stamped in red ink, followed by 3X. Much like Catherine, Betty was left so terrified by the incident that she never contacted the police and was only tracked down after they discovered Noel's body. However, Betty's description of the crime and the perpetrator was so similar to the story provided by Catherine that it now seemed obvious that both women were telling the truth. Sure enough, ballistic tests would soon show that the bullets used to kill Joel and Noel were both fired from the same gun. Investigators discovered a newspaper clipping about Joseph Mozynski's death in Noel's pocket, which had presumably been left there by the killer. Mozynski was stamped on it in red ink, and the words, "Here's how," were written in the margins. Oddly, a wadded roll of cash was also found at the murder scene inside a blood-stained magazine. Well, the same day Noel's body was discovered, the Evening Journal and the police each received a new letter signed by 3X, and in the latter case, a spent .32 caliber shell casing was also included in the same envelope. The second letter mentioned Noel's murder and referred to him as V5 Sowley and stated, quote, "Some of our money was found on his person and the NY document." He concluded by writing, quote, 13 more men and 1 woman will go if they do not make peace with us and stop bleeding us to death," end quote. For the first time, the Evening Journal decided to publish the 3X letters, and sure enough, on the morning of June the 18th, they received another letter which read, quote, "Tonight, 1 more will go. You may let them know 3X is the man behind the gun. He asked for no quarter, but will give none. On June the 18th at 9 p.m., I will be at College Point to get WR-V-8, end quote. Well, as you can imagine, this letter sent the police into overdrive as they orchestrated a massive manhunt for 3X involving over 2,000 officers who hoped to prevent him from committing another murder that night. Well, in the end, nothing did happen, but of course, the Evening Journal received another letter from 3X the following afternoon, which was postmarked from the previous evening. It started off by saying, quote, "WR-V-8 of CP has returned the Philadelphia XV-346 to me tonight after reading your paper. Also $37,000 of blackmail money. Thanks to God, if I may use his name," end quote. As you might recall, in one of his previous letters, the writer had stated that Philadelphia XV-346 was one of the papers he was attempting to retrieve. He now said that only document NJ-4-3-44, as well as $39,000, was still missing. According to 3X, he would now spare the life of WR-V-8, along with the woman and 5 of the men he mentioned, but there were still 7 other men who were marked for death, and he referred to each of them by a code name, which consisted of a number followed by a letter, such as X14 and V4. He then provided a long code message consisting of several letters and numbers, and said that these 7 men needed to follow it if they wanted to continue living. Later that evening, a 50-year-old insurance salesman named Morris Horowitz was driving into his garage in Brooklyn when a man suddenly showed up next to his vehicle and pointed a gun at him. It seemed like an attempted carjacking, but when Horowitz resisted, the man pistol-whipped him and shot him in the shoulder. When Horowitz's wife witnessed the incident from the front porch and let out a scream, the gunman took off. The description Horowitz provided of the assailant did resemble the 3X killer, but since he was shot with a .45 caliber gun rather than a .32, it could not be established if this was the same person. The case would take another unexpected turn on June the 19th, when Joseph Mozynski's 41-year-old brother, John Mozynski, a plumber who lived in the Philadelphia suburb of Port Richmond, received his own bizarre letter. This one was postmarked from Philadelphia, and the writer ordered John to deliver him some valuable documents, which would be placed in a newspaper and left inside the men's room at Broad Street Station. If John did not have these documents, he was to leave instructions about how to find the person who actually did have them. Of course, the letter was signed by 3X, and contained the same inverted and upright V symbols, and the handwriting was determined to be identical to the letters which were sent in New York. However, John, who hadn't seen his brother since Memorial Day, maintained that he had no knowledge of these documents that 3X was referring to. He would be placed under police protection, and his friends and family even went so far as to surround his house. Even though John never provided any documents to 3X, the Evening Journal would hear some surprising news when they received another letter from him on June the 21st. He started out the letter by stating, quote, "The last document, NJ 4-3-44, returned to us on the 19th at 9 p.m. My mission has ended. There is no further cause for worry." End quote. 3X then went on to provide details about his backstory, claiming that he was a former officer in the German army from Berlin who joined a secret organization known as the Red Diamond of Russia. He then explained what the signature on his letters meant, as the inverted V represented the Supreme Tribunal of the Order, while the upright V represented Special Agent. When you combine those two Vs, they form the cryptic symbol, which represented the Red Diamond of Russia. By placing them next to his signature, the implication seemed to be that he was a special agent who went by the code name 3X. Anyway, 3X explained that the reason Joseph Mozynski and Noel Sowley were murdered was because they were former members of Red Diamond who were dismissed for committing treason after becoming involved with a gang of blackmailers and drug smugglers. The 3 secret documents which 3X had referred to were stolen for blackmail purposes, so the organization's Supreme Council had 12 of their special agents draw from a deck of cards, and whoever drew the King of Diamonds would be sent on a mission to get the documents back. Well, since 3X picked that particular card, he got the assignment, and he had now completed his mission. He concluded the letter by stating that he was returning to Russia, and that any further letters they received from 3X would be fakes. He stated, quote, "Quiet your people and tell them that 3X is no more." Not surprisingly, Joseph Mozynski and Noel Sowley's loved ones completely denounced these claims that they had once belonged to a secret Russian organization. Investigators were also skeptical that this would be the last letter, and indeed, over the next several months, the police and the press would receive more letters signed by 3X. But interestingly enough, none of them featured the 2 Vs, aka the symbol for the Red Diamond of Russia, so no one could be certain if the letters were written by the original author or a copycat. A $5,000 reward was offered for information, and one of the most interesting tips came from a drifter named Dewey Eade, who claimed that on June the 22nd, one day after the final letter was sent, he met up with a stranger at a restaurant outside Coatesville, Pennsylvania. According to Eade, this man matched the description of the 3X killer, spoke in a foreign accent, and he appeared to have some papers written in code inside his wallet. Since they were both heading in the direction of Lancaster, the 2 men walked together for several miles until the stranger confessed that he had killed 2 people, attempted to murder a 3rd man, and had been on a mission to kill 14 people in total. He said he had been sent on this mission by the Red Diamond of Russia to recover some papers, and now that he had succeeded, his plan was to head to Harrisburg and then New Orleans before circling back to New York in order to catch a boat back home to Russia. After spending the night together in a culvert, Eade and the stranger went their separate ways, but he was never located. Throughout the course of the investigation, police rounded up a number of promising suspects, but whenever they were shown to Catherine May and Betty Ring, they always confirmed that it was not the person who attacked them. Since Noel's murder had taken place in close proximity to the Creedmoor State Hospital for the Insane, it was theorized that the killer might have been a patient there, but there was no record of any escaped patients on the nights of the murders. Catherine and Betty were even brought to the hospital and asked to view all the patients there, but they failed to identify any of them. One of the most promising suspects was a 38-year-old Russian church sexton from Mount Vernon named Nicholas LaRoche, who had a drug addiction and popped up on the radar when he was caught forging a prescription which revealed handwriting that looked similar to the 3X letters. Catherine and Betty were asked to identify LaRoche, but even after thinking about it for a half an hour, they ultimately concluded that he was not the man they saw. When no further progress could be made, the investigation to find the 3X killer scaled down considerably. Over the course of the next few years, police would continue to look at potential suspects, but would always hit a dead end when the 2 female survivors failed to identify them. There would be more letters from 3X in which he threatened to commit additional murders, but they would never take place, leading to speculation that the letters were written by copycats. Officially, the only 2 murders which have ever been linked to him are Joseph Mozynski and Noel Sowley, and as far as anyone can tell, he may have actually kept his word when he wrote that 3X is no more. After 90 years, the identity of the person who committed the 3X murders, as well as his motive for the crime, continue to remain unknown. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Anyway, like I mentioned in the intro, even if you've never heard of this particular case, I'm sure that many elements of it sounded familiar. Of course, I probably don't have to tell you that a killer attacking couples while they're parked in lovers' lane areas before sending cryptic letters to the press is very reminiscent of the Zodiac killer. In fact, if the Zodiac is ever identified and captured someday, one of the first questions I'd ask him is if the 3X murders inspired him. And I'm sure pretty much all of you are familiar with the Son of Sam murders committed by David Berkowitz in New York City 4 decades later, which also involved shooting couples while they were inside parked cars and sending out cryptic letters. But of course, Berkowitz cast a reign of terror over New York for an entire year before he was captured, whereas the 3X killer only decided to commit 2 crimes that anyone knew of, and then just stopped. That's the biggest thing which differentiates this from the Zodiac, because he took credit for a number of murders in his letters that he may not have actually committed, whereas 3X wrote that he was not going to kill anyone else besides his first 2 victims, and he may have actually been telling the truth. Even though this case is mostly forgotten about today, I shouldn't downplay what a sensational story it was in New York City at the time it happened, and the massive manhunt which ensued once 3X sent in the letter where he threatened to kill someone at a specific time later that same night. One of my favorite details of this story is how over 100 officers dressed up as women and sat inside a parked car at a secluded lovers' lane hangouts alongside an undercover male officer. This was done to give off the false impression that they were a couple making out, in case this drew the killer out into the open. While the Zodiac and Son of Sam cases are very famous, I think one of the main reasons that 3X is not as well known is because technically, he's not considered to be a serial killer. To be classified as one, you generally have to murder 3 or more people, whereas 3X's confirmed victim count was only 2. There's also the fact that he let his victims' female companions live, even though they were eyewitnesses to his crimes and could easily identify him. He even went so far as to make sure these women got home safely by escorting them to the nearest public transportation, but he had this weird moral quandary where he was willing to rape one of them, but left the other one alone because she had a religious medal. I also think the reason unidentified serial killers such as Zodiac and Jack the Ripper inspire so much discussion is because a number of different people have been looked at as potential suspects, and there's debate about who is the most likely candidate to be the perpetrator. But that really isn't the case with 3X. Even though a number of people were looked at as suspects at the time, they were all eliminated once the 2 female survivors confirmed it wasn't them. I guess the closest thing they had to a promising candidate was Nicholas LaRoche, because the women had to think about it for at least half an hour before they made up their mind, so at least there was some uncertainty. Otherwise, there were no compelling suspects at all, and whoever 3X was, it seems like he was able to slip through everyone's fingers. So this episode will not be a discussion about the identity of 3X, since there isn't much to talk about there. Rather, we're going to focus on potential motives for his crimes, as well as possible reasons for selecting his victims, because nothing about this case makes a lick of sense. I think the one thing I can say with reasonable certainty is that 3X was not actually a special agent who was sent on a mission by the Red Diamond of Russia to recover important documents and kill Joseph Mozynski and Noel Sowley because they betrayed the organization. I mean, I gotta admit, the guy went to a lot of trouble to fabricate an elaborate backstory for himself, but let's talk about the victims, who both seemed like nothing more than regular, ordinary people. We have one guy with a wife and 2 children who owned a grocery store, and the other was a 26-year-old radio mechanic. 3X's scenario is like something out of a spy novel, where sleeper agents from Russia are sent to America in order to infiltrate their society and pass themselves off as ordinary citizens. I admittedly don't know what Joe and Noel's entire backstory is, but I can only assume that if they had significant gaps in their histories to suggest they once lived in Russia and were part of some secret cabal, someone would have noticed. And for some reason, 3X also seemed to believe that Joe's brother John, a plumber from Philadelphia, had enough pull to deliver him the documents he was looking for. I really love the irony of 3X sending a letter in which he revealed he was a secret agent and spilled all the details about this underground organization he worked for. If 3X was telling the truth, I imagine his superiors would be pretty pissed off at him for sharing all their big secrets to be published in the newspapers. All that being said, if this nonsense about the Red Diamond of Russia was a complete fantasy, what was 3X's real motive for these murders? I seriously doubt that Joel and Noel were secret agents, but it seems pretty obvious that 3X deliberately targeted them and did not just choose his victims at random. This is strongly supported by the fact that the notes he gave to the 2 female survivors had the victim's last name stamped on them in red ink, which is something he would have had to do beforehand. Given that both victims were killed while parked alone in remote areas, the chances of the killer coming across them by pure chance are slim, but why did the killer specifically target them? What's particularly bizarre is that I'm not sure Joel and Noel had any discernible connection to each other. Before 3X shot Noel, he asked him if he knew Joe Mozynski, and Noel apparently didn't have any idea who he was talking about. This begs the question of whether 3X was so mentally ill that he genuinely believed the fantasies he was spouting in his letters, or if he was knowingly making the whole story up in order to conceal his real reasons for the crime. He seemed to justify his crimes by painting himself as the secret agent who was completing an important mission for his superiors and only had to kill these 2 victims because they were traitors who stole from them. Yet even though he tried to portray the 2 female survivors as complete innocents who had nothing to do with these issues, that didn't stop him from flat-out raping Catherine May, so 3X definitely came across as a complete hypocrite who often contradicted himself. But while these crimes didn't make much sense to anyone else, 3X may have had some sort of twisted logic in his head so that they made sense to him. You have to wonder if these murders were driven by some sort of moral outrage because both victims were making out with women who were years younger than them. What's interesting about Noel and Betty Ring is that while there was an 8-year age difference, they had actually been a couple in the past. Even though she was only 18 years old at this point, Betty had already gotten married and divorced to someone else, which is what inspired her to rekindle her relationship with Noel. Joe's relationship with Catherine was a lot more problematic, since he was a 39-year-old married man with 2 children, having an affair with a woman who was half his age. Perhaps the reason 3X viciously raped Catherine, but was willing to spare Betty, is because he wanted to punish Catherine for knowingly conducting an affair with a married man. It's interesting how when the Evening Journal published a quote from one of Joe's relatives claiming that he had an additional mistress besides Catherine, 3X seemed to get really defensive about that. In fact, the article actually referred to Joe as the quote-unquote Don Juan grocery man of College Point, which is not the classiest thing to write about a murder victim. As you recall, in his next letter, 3X wrote, quote, "Not 2 women as stated in the papers, but 6, and 2 young girls, one 14 and one 15, were with them in that same place." End quote. I'm not sure if it was ever confirmed that there was any truth to his claims that Joe was involved with underage girls who were that young, but it could provide some insight into why 3X specifically targeted him. Perhaps Joe had an affair with someone which wound up angering 3X, but that wouldn't explain why he went on to kill Noel Sowley. Another detail I've always found strange is that in the first letter he sent following Joe's murder, 3X specifically wrote, quote, "The women may know where the missing papers are and who has them, since they were given to Mozynski." So by women, was he referring to Catherine May? If that's the case, why did he never attempt to ask her about these missing papers? Catherine claimed that the killer pulled some papers out of Joe's pockets and burned them, which would suggest he didn't find what he was looking for, but at no point did he ever inform her about what he was doing. If you look at most of the earliest newspaper articles, they make no mention of Catherine being raped, though that may have been done because of decency laws at that time, and a reluctance to write about sexual assault in the press. When you consider that she went through that traumatic ordeal, you have to feel horrible that Catherine had to subsequently endure being interrogated for days by investigators who did not believe her story and suspected she was involved in Joe's murder. The fact that Catherine provided a number of false confessions shows how easy it is for someone to tell their interrogators exactly what they want to hear in order to make the ordeal stop. If Noel had not been killed under similar circumstances, and Betty Ring not shared a completely identical story about how the crime went down, who knows how long suspicion would have been directed towards Catherine. I guess this is one of those cases in which a story that seemed too unbelievable to be true actually turned out to be real. Now, the circumstances of how Noel's death played out are even stranger, as 3X apparently flicked his flashlight on and off to deliver what looked like a Morse code signal to his quote-unquote friends watching nearby, but I think it's safe to assume that no one else was there. But according to Betty, when 3X searched Noel's pockets after shooting him, he grabbed something and exclaimed, "I have it." Sure enough, during his next letter, 3X confirmed that he had recovered one of the 3 missing documents he was searching for. He would later write that he retrieved the other 2 missing documents, but this is the only time where a witness saw him do it. So either 3X was just putting on a show for Betty, or he really bought into this fantasy he was spouting. Now, it's also possible that the actual motive for these murders was financial, and all the talk about the Red Diamond of Russia was just a cover story for a robbery. In his letters, he wrote that each time he retrieved the 3 missing documents, he also recovered some blackmail money. He mentioned finding some of the money on Noel when he killed him, and in the last 2 cases, he specifically mentioned separate amounts of $37,000 and $39,000. A roll of cash was found inside a magazine at Noel's murder scene, so one theory is that Noel could have had additional money on him that the killer did take, but he left a portion of it behind because he did not realize it was hidden in the magazine. Maybe that's why 3X specifically used the words, "some of our money," in his letter about Noel's death. But where would Noel have gotten this money to begin with? After all, he just seemed like an ordinary 26-year-old radio mechanic, and I see no indication that he was overly wealthy. Joe Mozynski's financial situation is a bit more interesting because he deposited $8,000 into his bank account only 1 month before he was killed. Adjusted for inflation, that's the equivalent of over $120,000 today. I mean, it sounds like Joe made a decent living as a grocery store owner, but considering that the United States was less than 1 year removed from the beginning of the Great Depression, that's a lot of money. However, Joe did have a baseball pool ticket receipt for $3,700 in his pocket when he was killed, so I think the implication might be that Joe liked to bet on sporting events, and this is where all the money came from. It's interesting how the ticket was stamped in Philadelphia, because 3X would later mention receiving $37,000 alongside the document Philadelphia XV 346. And of course, 3X would soon make a trip to Philadelphia in order to send a threatening letter to Joe's brother, John, ordering him to return one of the missing documents. But the ironic thing is that 3X wanted John to give him the document codenamed NJ4-3-44, not the Philadelphia one. According to his previous letters, the Philadelphia XV 346 document was already returned by someone codenamed WXV-8. That particular letter was postmarked from New York on June the 18th, while the letter John received on June the 19th was postmarked from Philadelphia, meaning that 3X had to take a trip there, possibly by train, in order to mail that letter. This only furthers the idea that he had some sort of weird personal grudge with Joe Mozynski because he actually went to the trouble of traveling 100 miles to threaten his brother. I mean, this was 1930, so you obviously just couldn't find out where John Mozynski lived by looking him up on Facebook, so 3X must have had some intimate knowledge of that family in order to know John's address. But if 3X's grudge was with the Mozynskis, then how does Noel Sowley fit into this? Now the timeline is interesting because 3X soon sent a letter claiming that his last document, NJ4-3-44, was returned to him on the evening of June the 19th, so he assured everyone that his mission was over and there would be no more killing. That particular letter was postmarked from Brooklyn on June the 20th, meaning that 3X had to make a return trip back to New York from Philadelphia. But even though 3X had demanded that John Mozynski return this final document, that obviously didn't happen, since John claimed to have no idea what he was talking about and remained in his home under police protection. So how did 3X retrieve the document? You know what? Considering that these documents probably never even existed to begin with, maybe I shouldn't spend so much time trying to answer these questions or look for any logic in 3X's letters. There were no other murders connected to 3X following his farewell letter, but maybe he did originally plan on killing more people and realized that since the manhunt for him had become so huge, there was too much of a risk of him being caught. Fabricating a scenario where all the documents were retrieved and his quote-unquote mission was over would give him a convenient excuse to stop the murders. It is interesting that all of his subsequent letters were only signed 3X and did not contain the two V's, which represented the symbol for the red diamond of Russia. It's possible that all these letters were just written by copycats, but if 3X was behind them, perhaps not including the symbol was his way of indicating he was no longer a secret agent and that his mission was over. But I do want to talk about the shooting of Morris Horwitz, which took place in Brooklyn on the evening of June the 19th, as well as the eyewitness sighting from Dewey Eade in Pennsylvania on June the 22nd. I have a feeling that the Horwitz shooting was nothing more than a carjacking gone wrong by some other random criminal and had no connection to 3X. We know that 3X was in Philadelphia on June the 19th to mail the letter to John Mozynski, and while he theoretically could have traveled back to New York in order to commit this crime in Brooklyn that same night, the MO is just completely different. But when Dewey Eade had his encounter with the stranger in Pennsylvania who resembled 3X, this man apparently mentioned that he had killed two people and attempted to kill a third man, and some people wondered if this third man he was referring to might have been Horwitz. Well, June the 22nd was the day after 3X's final letter arrived, so it's not impossible that he could have fled New York and traveled to another state. He did provide a number of details about this guy, which perfectly matched the 3X killer, but most of these same details were published in the newspapers, so Eade easily could have gotten them from there in order to fabricate a story. Yes, once again, I know this was the pre-internet age of 1930, so information did not circulate as quickly, but this story did get a lot of coverage in the papers in Pennsylvania, so even though he was a drifter, it's not impossible that Eade could have come across one of these papers and learned this information. It's odd how this stranger supposedly told Eade that he was planning to travel to Harrisburg to New Orleans before returning back to New York to catch a boat home to Russia, which really doesn't make much logical sense. And I also find it weird that even though this guy confessed to being responsible for multiple murders, Eade apparently had no qualms about spending the night with them inside a culvert. If this were any other case, I might not put too much stock into Eads' eyewitness sighting, but since all of the leads to find the suspect in New York hit a complete dead end, I have no trouble believing that he did leave the city following his final letter. Like I mentioned earlier, in spite of police looking at a number of different suspects, none of them panned out, as the 2 female survivors ruled them all out as being the killer. I know I frequently mentioned on this podcast that eyewitness misidentification is one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions, as even a rape survivor can sometimes identify the wrong person as being their attacker. But while we obviously have no way to measure this, I'd be curious to know how often eyewitnesses do see the correct person and fail to identify them. In the case of Catherine and Betty, they not only witnessed a murder and survived a sexual assault, but they spent a great deal of time walking, conversing, and riding on public transportation with 3X, so I'm sure they probably had a vivid recollection of him and would have been able to identify the correct person if they saw him. The physical description they provided of 3X was pretty generic, as they said he was a short, slender man who appeared to be in his 30s or 40s. You might notice that the cover photo I've used for this episode is the original composite sketch they ran in the papers of a creepy-looking figure in a suit and a fedora with a shadow covering his face. But I'm not entirely sure how accurate that sketch was, and I don't know if it would have helped many eyewitnesses identify him. However, 3X's most distinct trait was his thick accent, which the 2 women believed was German, and would be supported by the claim in one of his letters that he was a former officer in the German army. But for all we know, this guy may have become so lost in his delusional fantasy that he completely faked the accent, so it wasn't an accurate representation of his real voice. I wish there was more information about this Russian church sexton, Nicholas LaRoche. I'm guessing he probably spoke with an accent, because if Catherine and Betty had to think about it for a while before they decided LaRoche wasn't the killer, there must have been something about him to give off the impression that he could be the guy. But my gut tells me that neither of these women ever did come into contact with the person who actually attacked them. I should also mention one final postscript to this story, which may or may not be connected to the 3X murders. In October of 1937, a young couple, 19-year-old Frances Hayek and 20-year-old Louis Weiss, were found murdered inside a parked car in a secluded wooded area in Queens, located about a mile away from Creedmoor State Hospital. They were both shot twice in the right temple with a .25 caliber automatic. Frances was stabbed 7 times in the chest, and money was missing from both Frances's pocketbook and Louis's wallet. But the oddest detail was that the killer had used Frances's lipstick to draw crimson circles on both of the victims' foreheads, so the crime became known as the Red Circle Murders. Of course, there were enough similarities to create speculation that the crime may have been committed by 3X, but no conclusive connection could be made, and the murders were never solved. If you go to newspapers.com and do a search on the 3X murders and the Red Circle murders, you'll see that they actually both got mentioned alongside each other a few times in some articles which were published while the Son of Sand murders were taking place, as all these cases involved couples being shot inside parked cars. As far as I can tell, the investigation never turned up any solid suspects in the Red Circle murders, so I guess it's possible that 3X could have resurfaced 7 years after the fact and decided to commit another shooting, only with a completely different MO from his previous crimes. I mean, after making such a public spectacle of himself with his first 2 murders, could 3X really have just stopped and never killed again? It is possible that 3X committed other murders, and they just never linked them together, but that's nothing but pure speculation. Overall, I really do not know what to make of the whole thing. 3X may have been completely delusional when he shared all that nonsense involving underground Russian organizations and a secret mission to recover classified documents, but that still doesn't change the fact that he needed to have some sort of motive to commit this crime and select these particular victims. Many serial killers pick their victims completely at random, but there's enough evidence to suggest that 3X specifically wanted to kill Joseph Mozynski and Noel Sowley, Two men who did not seem to have any apparent connection to each other. From what Catherine and Betty said, neither man gave off any indication that they recognized 3X or had any idea who he was. So was this just a case of a guy being so lost in his fantasy world that he genuinely believed these two people he was killing were secret agents? Or was the whole thing just a cover story to hide the real reason he did this? Again, the fact that 3X traveled to Philadelphia to threaten Joe's brother suggested that he may have had some sort of history with that family, but I just don't see how that links to Noel's murder. For all we know, there might be something in either or both these men's backgrounds to shed some light on why 3X decided to murder them, but if there is, it sounds like investigators never found it. Anyway, I'm not going to deliver my usual spiel about contacting the appropriate authorities if you have any information about this case, because anyone who would have information is probably long dead. And unlike other cases involving unidentified killers, I'm not sure if any DNA evidence connected to these crimes was ever preserved. Whoever 3X was, he managed to get away with it without leaving any solid evidence which could identify him. If you want to learn more information about this case, I'd recommend reading a Kindle book from author Jason Lucky Morrow titled Famous Crimes the World Forgot, which has an entire chapter devoted to the 3X murders. And if you have a newspapers.com account, you can find thousands of old articles from when this story originally took place, but prepare to find yourself immersed inside a very deep rabbit hole. So that about brings an end to this week's episode, but if you have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we released an episode about the bizarre story of Jody Roberts, who went missing from Washington State in 1985 before she was discovered to be alive and living under a new identity 12 years later after suffering an apparent case of amnesia. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I would also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Emily H. and Mandy M. Thank you so much for your support. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.